So today's gospel text is one of those texts that is likely really familiar to most of us. The so-called feeding of the 5,000. Really, it's much more than 5,000 because the 5,000 only counts the men. Probably much, much more than that if we count the women and children in the crowd. It is perhaps one of Jesus' most famous deeds of power. It appears in some form in each of the Gospels. And in Matthew and Mark, it's shortly followed by the feeding of the 4,000. So we get this story a number of times, or a similar story a number of times in the text. But it's also one of those texts that we tend to hear alone outside of its wider context. Right? Or we mash them together in our heads. And story Bibles often do that. We get a lot of John's version in our story this morning with the kids. In Matthew, what's striking to me is that this story happens just after Jesus hears about the death of John the Baptist. So our text from Matthew says that he withdraws from the crowds. Perhaps he withdraws to tend his own grief. But also, it is just as likely that he withdraws to escape from Herod. And the Greek word that they use has this sense of withdrawing from battle or escaping danger. Right? I think likely it's a both and. On one hand, we see Jesus retreating to the sea to mourn, to grieve, to pray, to reflect on the mission that he has in this world, one that, as we know from the end of the story, will lead to the cross. Lead to a similar fate as John the Baptist. But yet on the other hand, he also retreats to escape the danger. The death of John the Baptist at the hands of Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great, heightens the danger for Jesus. And while we know Jesus' story will eventually lead to the cross, we're not quite there yet. There's more of Jesus' ministry to be done. To borrow language from the Gospel of John, his hour has not yet arrived. But there's a reality pointed to in this that Jesus and the kingdom of heaven that he inaugurates poses a threat to the powers of this world, to the political and religious establishments of his day. For the powers that be, the kingdom of heaven that Jesus brings doesn't feel like good news. The kingdom of heaven represents loss of power, loss of wealth, loss of resources. And the world as it is tries to shut that down, as we see in the death of John the Baptist. Contrast that to the crowds. When they heard it, which could be read either as the death of John the Baptist or that Jesus was withdrawing to the sea. But when they heard this news, they followed him on foot from the towns. For them, Jesus isn't a threat and the kingdom of heaven isn't a threat. Instead, they are hungry for more than bread. They thirst for more than water. For them, Jesus and the kingdom of God were indeed good news, and it felt like gospel. This is a Jesus that proclaimed lifting up the lowly, feeding the hungry, healing the sick, visiting the imprisoned, welcoming the stranger, the foreigner. Glimpses of the kingdom of heaven in this world made real in the acts of Jesus were what they were yearning for. So they go and follow. In preaching circles, we often talk about preaching as afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted. And that's far from an easy task of preaching. We talk about this because the gospel, the kingdom of heaven, well, in this world as it is a threat to the comfort of the comfortable. Casting down the powerful from their thrones doesn't feel or sound like good news to those on the thrones, for instance. It still is good news because the very things that give power, wealth, comfort in this world are often the same things that bind us. Our thrones become the things that bind us. We get caught up in the messages of the world, the messages that tell us we need to do more, be more, build more for ourselves in this world. Or the message that there just isn't enough, so we need to take it for ourselves. Jesus and the kingdom of heaven frees us from those things that bind us, but it often feels like a threat to our way of being. Yet the gospel and the kingdom of heaven, well, in this world as it is, tends to feel like good news for others. For others, it is a welcome balm for those who live under the bonds of oppression, food for those who are hungry, water for those who thirst. Whereas the powers that be want to kill Jesus and bring an end to the kingdom that he brings, for the crowds that we meet in the text today, the kingdom of heaven is exactly what they yearn for. When Jesus returns to the shore after withdrawing, he is met by this great crowd that is hungering, thirsting, yearning for him, for the good news that he brings. Our text tells us that he has compassion for them. Sometimes it might be translated as pity, but it is something even more that. He had splanchnizomai for them. It's one of my favorite Greek words, but it is gut-wrenching emotion. That kind of compassion that turns your stomach inside out, that twists your stomach into knots. Almost every time the Gospels tell us that Jesus had compassion or pity on someone or on the crowds, it is this gut-wrenching emotion that you feel in your stomach. We see that we have a God made known in Jesus who is moved to such deep emotions, gut-wrenching compassion for those who suffer, outrage at the injustices of the world, anger. Remember, Jesus flips tables and chases money changers out of the temple with whips. He even feels despair. Father, take this cup from me. In Jesus, we meet a God that feels and feels deeply for the sake of the world in need. That God who feels is a God who feeds, as an article in Working Preacher this week points out. The God who feels is moved to action. First, upon feeling this gut-wrenching compassion, Jesus begins to heal real bodies. And then he turns to feeding the crowd with real food. The disciples, realizing that it was late, recommend sending the crowds away so they could go buy food for themselves. Here in this gospel, their suggestion comes from a place of concern. In other gospels, the motives aren't always so kind. But here, they really do want the needs of the crowd met, and they're afraid by keeping the crowds longer, they're going to go hungry. If we don't wrap this up, they're not going to be able to get food later. But Jesus says they need not go away. You give them something to eat. To which they respond, we have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. The yeah, sure, Jesus responds, right? But then with 5 loaves and 2 fish, the disciples end up feeding the multitude. Again, 5,000 men plus women and children. All ate and were filled, and there was plenty left over. Rachel Held Evans, in her last book, Inspired, when talking about Jesus' miracles, says this. The miracles of Jesus prefigure a future in which there is no more suffering, no more death, no more stigmatization, no more exclusion, no more chaos. They show us what it looks like for God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. And they invite us to buy into that future now. With every act of compassion and inclusion, every step toward healing and reconciliation and love. She continues, hope, wrote N.T. Wright, is what you get when you suddenly realize that a different worldview is possible. A worldview in which the rich, the powerful, and the unscrupulous do not have the last word. The same worldview shift that is demanded by the resurrection of Jesus is the shift that will enable us to change the world. The miracles of Jesus aren't magic tricks designed to all prospective converts, nor are they tests from the past meant to sort true believers from doubters. They are instructions, they are challenges, they show us what to do and how to hope. Last week's message was over and against the messages of this world as it is. You are enough. And I will say that again. You are loved and you are enough. This week's message is with a God who feels over against the ways and the messages of this world as it is, that tries to tell us that resources are scarce and we have to compete or earn the basic things of life. Over and against all of that, there is enough. No, the message is even more than that. Over and against the messages of the world as it is, there is more than enough. Today, Jesus invites us into how God sees the world, how God intends the world to be. In feeding the multitude, Jesus shows us that for people that are enough, there is enough. There is more than enough. There is plenty to go around. How do we buy into that future now? How do we live out our lives in a way that reflects the abundance around us? Because there is more than enough in this country and in this world to ensure the care for all. And that indeed is good news for us and for all, because it is God's intent that people need not go away hungry, go away searching for life's basic needs. We can fall into the trap of believing the stories of this world as it is. The world that sees Jesus as a threat, the world that sees in the kingdom of God a threat, a loss of power, a loss of wealth, a loss of position. The world as it is that killed John the Baptist, the world that it is that crucifies Jesus in an attempt to stamp out the message. It's easy to believe those messages, that there just isn't enough in the world for everybody. It's easy to do, and we all do it from time to time, including myself. But today, through Jesus' miracle on the shore, we are invited into believing that these stories represent more than just a distant story in the past. We are invited to see a world in which these miracles are true. We are invited into the kind of world in which Jesus' miracles make a difference in the world, the kind of world in which all are fed and there's more than enough left over. We are invited into relationship with the one who feels and the one who feeds. And we are invited to act in this world in faith that Jesus' miracles are true, to participate in the kind of world that Jesus offers us, the kind of world that we trust that Jesus is still active in. Again, to quote Rachel Held Evans, perhaps a better question than do I believe in miracles is, am I acting like I do? Am I acting like this is some remote story that doesn't have any implications for my life and for this world? Or am I acting as if these miracles are true and that Jesus is still present and moving about this world among us? Do we dare to move about this world as if Jesus' actions on the lakeshore are true? The invitation brings with it a challenge to be moved in our guts when we encounter those hungering, those thirsting. A challenge to see the abundance around us that God provides. A challenge to turn outward rather than focus inward. A challenge to see the inherent worth of others and to not require people to earn the things they shouldn't have to earn. Love, dignity, respect, basic human needs. A challenge to see others as enough as we are enough. In every act of compassion, every act in which we are moved in our guts to care for the neighbor and the stranger, in every act of sharing the abundance around us, we buy into the kind of future God intends for us and for the world. In every act of compassion in which we are moved in our guts to care for the neighbor and stranger, in every act of sharing the abundance around us, we act like we believe the miracles of Jesus. Every time we dare to believe in miracles and dare to act like there is more than enough, we live into what it's like for God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven, and we get a